A businessman vanishes without a trace.
It seems like there's so much more to this scene than what meets the eye here.
The investigation has detectives looking in places they never imagined.
But once they began to unearth the clues, the answers came to light.
Melbourne, Florida.
Maryland Police Communications Officer Blum, how can I help you?
Yes, I'd like to report my brother missing.
His name, Donal O'Sullivan, and no one has seen or heard from him.
I think he was wearing jeans and a gray collared t-shirt.
Let's send an officer out there to take a report.
Appreciate your help, sir.
All right, thank you.
Detectives go to the last place he was seen.
When we first got to Mr. O'Sullivan's house, nothing really appeared to be out of order. In one of the bedrooms, however, we found a wallet with Mr. O'Sullivan's ID in it, but there were no credit cards or cash in the wallet. In looking around the bedroom a little further, we found a small amount of blood on the bed.
The crime scene unit is called in.
Once I had collected the blood sample from the bedroom, I then began looking around the residence for any additional physical evidence present.
And a careful scrutiny of the staircase catches the investigators' attention.
On the stair steps and the side walls of the stairs, there were individual indentations and pieces of wood chips that had been knocked off, resulting from what appears to be someone dragging a heavy object down the stairwell. On the kitchen flooring, there were wheel impressions that was consistent with possibly a dolly going from one end of the kitchen to the other and leading outside.
But the trail ends there. Police are left with a mystery. The blood is sent to the lab in search of a match in the repeat offenders database. And while Detective Casey waits for the results, he looks into the life of Donal O'Sullivan.
Mr. O'Sullivan was in his early 40s. He was single. He wasn't dating anybody. He had a network of friends that he associated with.
We knew that O'Sullivan hung out at a cafe downtown with some friends, so we arranged to meet with them or to see what we could learn.
Detectives pay the friends a visit. They describe him as a nice guy with a successful career in computers, a career that allowed him to retire early.
He was very predictable. They saw him all the time. He did the same types of things all the time. He is not the type of person that would just up and leave and not have any contact with anyone.
A routine check of O'Sullivan's credit cards yields some not-so-routine results.
We found quite a bit of activity after he was reported missing. The purchase of a freezer and a number of rental trucks, along with some heavy equipment rentals, like a backhoe.
Adding to the mystery, Casey learns that Mr. O'Sullivan's mail is still being picked up. But by who? O'Sullivan's friends say he would never disappear on purpose, but police are starting to wonder.
Missing person cases are very difficult because a lot of times adults will turn out missing for their own reasons. They want to be missing. We wanted to know what type of person we were dealing with, so we called in criminal profiler Dale Hinman.
I got a call from Mike Casey of the Melbourne Police Department. When a person is missing, one of the first things we need to consider is whether he disappeared because he wanted to or if he was taken against his will.
In this case, Agent Hinman thinks it's bad news.
When I looked at the crime scene photos and read the police reports, I thought that wherever Mr. O'Sullivan was, he was not there voluntarily and he was probably in danger.
Investigators know the first 48 hours are crucial, and time is running out if they hope to find their victim alive. Agent Hinman goes to O'Sullivan's home with Detective Casey to review the evidence.
This is Mr. O'Sullivan's house. Nobody's seen him in over 3 weeks.
Was there any indication of forced entry at the house?
No, in fact, we had to have a key to get in.
Well, it sounds like he may have known the offender and let him in. Is there any indication of a struggle inside?
Upstairs in one of the bedrooms is a sign of maybe a fight. It's a little bit disheveled up there. And right on this side of the mattress over here is where we found the blood.
Do you have a crime scene picture of that?
Yes, I do, right here.
It looks like some type of violent interaction occurred at this location, something more than just perhaps a robbery. With the victim missing from the scene and blood on the bed, if the person just came here to do a robbery and didn't know him, then it would make more sense just to restrain the victim and leave. So if there was a violent interaction between Mr. O'Sullivan and someone else, the offender must have moved the body.
To Dale, that means the two knew each other.
Was there anything missing?
Right here on this chair was a wallet. It had Mr. O'Sullivan's ID in it, but there was no cash, and there were no credit cards. One of the things that we've done is we've kept the credit card accounts open, and we're monitoring them right now.
That's a very good idea.
When Agent Hinman learns one of the purchases on the credit card was a freezer, all the other evidence begins to fall into place.
And the purchase date on the freezer was after the victim was reported missing?
Yes, it was. We discovered quite a bit of damage along the railing here. We also had wood chips and very consistent indentations on each step going down.
Sounds like it was a person acting alone, removing this freezer from the residence and banging into the wall and to the railing. So it's more likely to be a man who was doing this by himself. It was hard to avoid the conclusion that Mr. O'Sullivan had been killed in his home and then his body had been taken away in the freezer. But whoever did this would have had to buy a freezer, drag it up the stairs, place the victim in the freezer, and then take it back down the stairs, leaving a lot of damage to the railings and the stairs on the way out of the house. Disagreements that turn violent are often about love or money. In this case, Mr. O'Sullivan wasn't dating anyone, but he did have various financial interests. We thought the investigation should focus on his business dealings.
Detective Casey discovers that O'Sullivan has a rental property in the area and goes to visit tenants Daniel Tennedy and David Fiddler. Tennedy isn't home, but Fiddler is.
David Fiddler was a close associate with O'Sullivan and had known him for quite some time.
Fiddler tells police he hasn't seen Mr. O'Sullivan in weeks. Detectives keep digging, and they find out that Mr. O'Sullivan owns a piece of land in nearby Canaveral Grove. Police learn that O'Sullivan bought the land and gave it to Fiddler. But when they check the deed to the land, they see something peculiar.
Fiddler's name had been crossed off, which was very suspicious in and of itself.
We thought that whatever happened to Mr. O'Sullivan could have been the result of a business deal gone bad. It appeared that he gave Fiddler a piece of property as a gift, and then he took it back. Some kind of fight between the two men could have been the reason for Mr. O'Sullivan's disappearance.
What does David Fiddler know about Donal O'Sullivan's disappearance? Donal O'Sullivan is missing, and police think his friend David Fiddler knows more than he's letting on.
It appeared that Mr. O'Sullivan gave David Fiddler a piece of land as a gift. Then he apparently changed his mind and crossed his name off the deed. We wondered what happened between these two men that may have ended in a fight.
Detective Casey needed to have another talk with David Fiddler.
When Sergeant Casey talked to him, David Fiddler denied any knowledge of Mr. O'Sullivan's disappearance or about a deed.
Fiddler was at a loss for the deed completely. He had no idea that it existed. I mean, he had absolutely no explanation for it.
There was no evidence to prove that David Fiddler knew anything about Mr. O'Sullivan's disappearance.
Fiddler's alibi is holding up.
We all still thought the property and the deed were important, so we decided to drive out to the land to have a look.
But the lot is enormous.
We all knew there was a good chance that Mr. O'Sullivan's body was going to be inside the freezer, but the piece of property was so large, we needed some help to narrow down the focus of our search. Detective Casey called the Brevard County Sheriff's Office to see if they might be able to help. They brought in a helicopter equipped with a heat sensor. The heat sensor helps investigators examine a large area in an attempt to locate ground that had been recently disturbed or dug up.
As the helicopter flies over, police use a special imager that can detect even small amounts of body heat.
It showed us one area that appeared to be a little warmer than others. So we went up there, executed the warrant, started digging.
It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, but after just a few feet, they hit something solid.
The very first place we looked is where we found the freezer. There was enough odor coming from the freezer that we were pretty confident in what we would find inside the freezer.
The freezer is taken to the medical examiner's office to be opened.
Inside the freezer, the top layer was a layer of concrete that was chipped through to find a layer of potting soil. Underneath, we found an additional layer of what we found out was kitty litter. And then under that was material that turned out to be the exterior of a sleeping bag.
And inside the sleeping bag are the remains of a man. A man who the medical examiner determines has been strangled.
His hands were handcuffed and his feet were bound with telephone cord. Also, his mouth was bound with tape.
It was impossible to make a positive identification from him visually.
Hi, Doctor. How you doing?
To get an ID, detectives turn to dental records.
Teeth are the most durable part of the body, and they'll remain after most of the body is destroyed. They're an excellent forensic tool.
Forensic odontologists look for anything about a person's teeth that may be different. The more dental work and the more unusual the characteristics are, the easier it is to identify someone.
We were able to positively identify this victim as Mr. O'Sullivan.
It's official. The Donal O'Sullivan case is now a homicide.
Whoever killed Mr. O'Sullivan kept adding layer upon layer in an attempt to reduce the odor of the corpse. Each layer showed the growing panic of the offender as he was trying to hide the body. This was someone that we all considered to be an inexperienced murderer. He must have thought that if he could continue to hide Mr. O'Sullivan's body, then he could continue to spend his money and get away with the murder.
Detectives meet at the police station with Agent Hinman to talk about the kind of suspect they are looking for.
I think that the elaborate way the victim's body was disposed of really suggests not a stranger, but a friend or a co-worker of the victim's. The person has had some financial dealings with the victim in the past, and the person is going to continue to spend the victim's money until he's caught. When an offender goes to such great lengths to dispose of a body, it's usually because he knows the victim and wants to distance himself from the victim.
We were actually contacted by Mr. O'Sullivan's bank a little while ago, and they informed us that there's some activity on his accounts as far as forged checks that they think are occurring right now. In going through his checks, we discovered a check that had been made out to a storage facility in a warehouse complex.
Casey and crime scene technician Scott Dwyer head to the facility hoping for a break in the case. When they open Mr. O'Sullivan's space, they find nothing of interest. But police learn there's another storage space they should check.
The manager of the facility mentioned that one of O'Sullivan's friends recently began renting a space there.
And when they looked at the check, they got a surprise.
That had been paid for through a check belonging to the victim O'Sullivan.
One of the forged checks. And who does the space belong to?
We tracked down who had the storage facility rented in their name, and that turned out to be Daniel Tennedy.
Daniel Tennedy, the roommate of one-time suspect David Fiddler and tenant of Dunal O'Sullivan. Police get a search warrant to open Tennedy's storage space, and what they find is more than any of them could have imagined. Detectives find out that a man named Daniel Tennedy rented a storage space and paid for it with victim Dunal O'Sullivan's money. When police open his storage space, they find some very incriminating items.
We discovered bags of kitty litter, bags of potting soil, several empty bags of cement mix.
These were the same materials that were found in the freezer with the victim's body.
Detective Casey returns to the police department and runs a check on Tennedy, and he learns something that will make this search a little bit easier.
We discovered that he was incarcerated at the Brevard County Jail.
Daniel Tennedy had been arrested for fraud in New York, and he skipped out on his bail. He was subsequently apprehended in Florida. Before they interviewed Tennedy in jail, the detectives took a photograph of him to the victim's bank. The bank manager positively identified Tennedy as the person who was cashing the forged checks.
Detective Casey goes to talk with his suspect.
I talked to you on Friday, and you lied to us about a lot of different things.
What you did, you broke the law.
Yeah, I realize that.
Tennedy confesses to murdering Dunal O'Sullivan.
I'm just going to say one thing.
What's that?
I'm just, what happened, it wasn't an intentional thing with Max. An argument, and I know how it looks with, like because he was in a freezer. It's just, it happened. I panicked. And then I just couldn't think of no way of just, so I had to, you try to think, well, he has some kind of coffin or something to bury him.
Daniel Tennedy had been working for Mr. O'Sullivan. Apparently, Mr. O'Sullivan discovered discrepancies in his accounts and thought that Daniel Tennedy was stealing from him. David Fiddler was not connected to this crime.
We believe that the night of his disappearance that there was a confrontation between Tennedy and O'Sullivan at O'Sullivan's house.
The motive for this crime was definitely money. Daniel Tennedy needed it, and Mr. O'Sullivan had it. Before he was caught, Daniel Tennedy spent over $28,000 of Mr. O'Sullivan's money. Tennedy was charged with forgery and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 47 years in prison. Daniel Kennedy thought that all of his hard work to cover up his crime would let him get away with murder. Thanks to the hard work of the Melbourne Police Department, he didn't.